All right, kia ora everyone, and welcome to this Denton's Kensington Swan webinar on the reset budget and the implications that it has or will have for the political landscape in New Zealand. I'm Hayden Wilson. I'm a partner in the Wellington Public Law and Litigation team, and my co-presenter today is
Linda Clark, and I work alongside Hayden as one of the partners in Denton's Kensington Swan's Wellington Public Law Office.
So thank you all for joining us. We are recording this webinar, so it will be available online after we have finished. And you'll all probably in this COVID world be familiar with Zoom webinars and the various tools, but there's a Q&A function you should find at the bottom of your screen. As we go through, if you've got any questions or queries, feel free to pop them into the Q&A into that Q&A box, and we will try and round up the Q&As as we come towards the end of the presentation. So to kick us off, obviously COVID-19 has been a fundamental, once in a century, once in a lifetime, once in many lifetimes, shock to both the New Zealand and the global economy. It's been particularly shocking because it's a shock that we don't have a plan to deal with. It's different from the GFC in that effectively we've had a massive reduction in both demand and supply. To put it in context, the New Zealand Treasury's predictions leading up to the budget suggest a 4.6% decrease in New Zealand's real GDP in the second quarter of 2020, with unemployment rising to nearly 10%. And the government's response in the budget, pushing out New Zealand's core crown debt from just under 20% of our GDP to close to 55% of GDP by 2023, based on what they are doing now to respond to COVID-19. To put that in context, New Zealand is coming from a pretty good debt base. Debt to GDP ratios of 60% and above are not uncommon for economies that we tend to measure ourselves with, but for New Zealand, keeping crown debt down has always been a really important principle for governments of whatever colour, and so a really significant increase in core crown debt is a major move in the New Zealand landscape, and the thing that shouldn't be forgotten is that's just crown debt. And while New Zealand has always had, or has always pushed to have low core crown debt in our political sphere, we've always had very, very high personal and individual debt in our economy, and that is unlikely to change. One of the important things about Treasury's forecasts in the budget is that very many commentators consider them to be extremely optimistic, and particularly the unemployment figures. ANZ came out and said that they think that the Treasury's unemployment forecasts are undercooked, and that unemployment is likely to be higher and last for longer than Treasury is presently predicting.
The other thing to say about unemployment, the other thing to say about unemployment, of course, is that even if Treasury's predictions are correct, and as Hayden says, many think that they're too optimistic. I certainly think they are too optimistic, but it will be unevenly spread. So 8.3% might be overall unemployment, but what's already been identified is that this particular economic shock is going to affect or impact young working New Zealanders more than others. So we're going to have much higher rates of unemployment in the under 30s. And of course, as always, when there's an economic shock, Māori and Pacific workers always come out of it worst. So we're expecting to see very high rates of Māori unemployment in particular. Some people picking it could be as high as 25, 27%.
And as you say, Linda, that the way that falls, I mean, when you think about the industries that have been particularly affected by COVID-19 and our response and the global response, hospitality has been shut for 8 weeks. Tourism has effectively been, international tourism in New Zealand has effectively been wiped out and will have to restart itself again from the ground up. And those are particularly industries that have a much younger cohort in them. And in some ways, those Treasury forecasts, while they are rosy, do look, well, not rosy, that's the wrong way to describe unemployment going to 10%. While they are perhaps optimistic, they are made to look a little bit better when you consider the situation globally. And the US Treasury is predicting that US GDP could fall as much as 30% in the second quarter alone, with unemployment skyrocketing in the United States, partly a product of their labour laws making it easier for businesses to lay off and furlough employees as they respond to the global shock. But US unemployment has increased by 10% in the space of under 2 months. And it's by far and away not the only place. And the note that we make there is that China has recorded its first decline in growth, however they calculate it, since the Mao era. And fundamentally, we've noted we're all Keynesians now. No one is suggesting that this response to this economic shock can be done by involving anything but massive involvement in governments, by governments in the economy to keep people employed and to keep people connected to work and to attempt to slowly drag us out of the shock that COVID-19 has produced. Which turns us, of course, to last week's budget and the political landscape as we are now only a few months out from the planned election here in New Zealand. So Linda, I'll hand over to you to talk about the polls.
Well, what a day to be having this conversation, actually, because if we had been talking about this yesterday, we might have been talking in slightly different terms, although I think not greatly. But the last night's shock poll from NewsHub Read Research is just jaw-dropping, to be honest. What we saw in the poll, if you have been under a rock for the last 24 hours and haven't heard about this, is that Labour is currently on 56%, National down to 30.6%. We'll talk about the minor parties in a moment, but let's just talk about those two major parties. Now, the thing to remember about this is this is first past the post. This is a first past the post poll result under an MMP government. Under MMP, you're simply not meant. The whole system is tilted against any party having more than 50% and being able to govern alone. There's a lot of nostalgia about this, and we saw, particularly under John Key's leadership, National's whole strategy was to get over 50%. But the system is designed to swing against that. But what we have now is a real crisis, post-crisis, post-COVID kind of love fest with Labour and with Jacinda Ardern in particular. And if you look at one of the other poll results that came out last night, which is that more than 90% of those polled were completely in support of the lockdown. Only 6% were opposed to it or felt uncomfortable about it. There lies the story. Whatever you think about Jacinda Ardern and this Labour-led government, New Zealanders have supported the way that the Prime Minister has led the country through this health crisis. Now, I'm making a deliberate separation here between the health crisis that we are hopefully emerging out of and the economic crisis that we are unfortunately heading into. We'll talk about those as two separate things. but there is overwhelming public support for the management of the health crisis. And I think we have to read into that there is also a pretty overwhelming repudiation of Simon Bridges' approach to that health crisis, which has, on a number of pivotal moments, he has misread the public mood or overstated the necessary negativity. And one of the costs of that, very, very difficult for any opposition leader, it needs to be said, to ride through a crisis like this, where the politics really is sort of put to one side and people are not thinking about who they want to be led with in a tribal way. What they're thinking is, am I in safe hands? And New Zealanders felt in safe hands. And the flip side of that, of course, is that they've judged Simon Bridges in a way that says, if you'd been in charge, would I have been in safe hands? I don't think so. And that's why what we also saw last night is this total collapse of support for him personally, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. There is purportedly another opinion poll out on Thursday of this week on TV1, either Thursday or over the weekend. You'd expect it to say much the same, to be honest. The TV3 poll has tended to be slightly more extreme, but I would expect that the polling from TV1 will be pretty much the same, and that's going to set in motion a whole lot of steps, which again we'll talk about in a moment. Just talk very briefly about the other figures though. 2.7% for New Zealand First, 5% is the threshold. There's a place that Winston Peters has been before, where you've been in government, he's been supportive of the coalition leader, and then he's found himself not able to translate that into a 5% support rate on the key day, which is polling day. So things are going to get tense with him. The Greens on 5.5%, that's pretty good for them actually as to where they are, and ACT doing better than they did on election date. And I think that if you look at how David Seymour has led his party through the term, that's probably well deserved, COVID or no COVID. Hayden, anything you want to add to that?
I think the Greens will actually be really, really pleased. I mean, they have been basically invisible throughout the COVID response, and you could have expected, and in fact I expected them to be damaged by Labour's popularity. I expected New Zealand First to hold up a bit better than they have, because some of them have been at least seen, albeit Winston was fishing during the COVID process. So this poll result, if it holds, changes one of my thinking, the aspects of my thinking around New Zealand First, because I had thought that they would probably come in just over 5% and be pretty happy with that, and that could influence how they behave between now and the election. Now they're very much back in the same historical place that they have been in when they've been in government. They are facing an uphill battle to get back into Parliament, and I think that will, as we'll talk about a little bit later, play into Winston's natural tendency to want to separate himself a little bit from the government in the lead up to an election campaign.
I think that the proviso on that, though, is that, I mean, I personally don't expect the polls to hold like this right through to election day. I mean, I think this level of polling for Labour explains why the Prime Minister has been quite resolute that the election will not be put off or delayed as a result of COVID. I've got some concerns about that. I think that actually it will be very difficult to campaign in the way that we've used to see campaigns being run. On a sort of, maintaining social distancing and so forth. I think that it does put campaigning, or those campaigning, at a disadvantage. Nonetheless, this is why Labour wants to go in September and not wait till November, which is the alternative for them, because they will want to maximise this red wave as long as they can. I wouldn't expect it to hold at levels like that, but I think even if you think about it coming down 10 points, and that would still put Labour well ahead of where they were at the last election, what that does for New Zealand First, or what that does for national voters, is tricky. I mean, I think Winston will pick up votes on election day if national voters think that their team doesn't stand a show, because one of the things that national voters will be thinking is, okay, if it's going to be another 3 years of the red team, how do I put a handbrake on them as best I can? Now, voting Green is not going to do that. That's going to give them more license, probably. Voting National is not going to do that if you already have decided that the blue team's not going to get anywhere near the government benches. But voting for Winston Peters can do that. So he will be campaigning. He will campaign on that, and National are going to have to they're going to have somebody chomping at that flank as well as the other, and that puts them in an even more difficult position, actually. So it makes it it helps Winston in some ways, in that it gives him and voters a sharper focus about his value, or otherwise, depending on how you see him. But it puts National in a very, very difficult position. And I had absolutely no doubt that since that poll was published at 6 o'clock last night, the phones will have been ringing hot between caucus members as they try and work out what on earth is the best way forward now.
And we've had a couple of questions come in. Most of them pop up later on, so we'll deal with them as we get to them. But one from Michael, who says that, I think there's a possibility that watching Donald Trump's approach to the crisis has made it difficult for any opposition leader to challenge what the government is doing. And I absolutely agree. The job was impossible to start with, and has been made more impossible by the perhaps bumbling responses that we've seen in the United States and in Britain. I mean, when you think about how an opposition can respond to a challenge like this, their options are very, very limited. And perhaps the only thing that National could have done would have been to say, look, we appreciate that we're in a crisis. We disagree with what you're doing, but we also know that we're in a crisis, and so we're going to back you, and we're going to try and improve things. And that's not a natural position for any politician in our sort of system to take, and it might not have worked, but it was possibly the only answer that they could give.
I think they had a lot of wiggle room, actually. I think Paul Goldsmith, National's finance spokesperson, I think he was impressive, has been impressive during the health crisis part of this, because I think he was making the right noises, but I don't think he had enough. He was given enough oxygen by his own team, and they ought to have listened to him more. The thing that, and I don't agree. I mean, I see Michelle Bogue this morning, the former president of the National Party, saying that it's all the fault of lack of oxygen and poor old Simon didn't get a chance. I don't agree with that either. I think what National was able to secure at the very beginning of Parliament's lockdown was that extraordinary, and I use that in the sense that we haven't seen the like of it before, select committee that was created and led by Simon Bridges, and with a opposition majority. And the job of that select committee was to call whoever they wanted to come to the committee and to hear from people and to ask the right questions. And when that committee was working well, it was able to get responses from the government and tweaks and changes. But what happened in that committee under Bridges' leadership, and I think this goes to, he's got I know it's, everyone's quoting this now, his wife describes him as a dirty little scrapper, which is a great quality in an opposition leader, actually, but he has a tin ear. It's the problem that he continually, it continually confounds him. If he had used that role on the select committee to look more widely out and reach more widely into the community, and to have a series of nurses, GPs, small business owners, to actually have reached across the sort of top tier, if you like, of all of those organisations and gone out into the community, that select committee could have been much more influential in drawing attention to the problems that the government was creating for itself, because its response was admirable and impressive, but it wasn't faultless, because it couldn't be. This was a rolling wall of changes and accommodations, and the select committee could have been more successful if it had been prepared to reach out into the community, but they didn't. What they did, particularly towards the latter part of this, is that select committee was trying for big hits, like the idea that they would call in the Solicitor General and the Commissioner of Police and so forth. They overreached in all the wrong places, and they didn't reach carefully and skillfully enough in the right places, and I think that was a real lost opportunity.
There's an element of that bad trait that some lawyers have of wanting to take every point rather than take the good ones to that whole response.
Yeah, and the public knew some of this was going wrong, right? The public had a sense of it. I mean, I had talked to a lot of people in hospitality running small cafes and small businesses, and they were really hurting, and they were wobbly at various points along the line, where they were saying to me, do you think we should get out of lockdown? Do you think this has gone on too long? They were wobbly. So there was a conversation to be had with people doing it really hard, in the same way as we saw from the Mangere Food Bank and other social service providers. Unprecedented demand for food parcels, unprecedented call on those services from people who had no income and no way of feeding their families. And we didn't see enough of those either at the select committee. And I mean, that's heartland Labour, right? You want to take on Jacinda Ardern, keep talking about child poverty. So there were places to go for the opposition, but I think sometimes it wasn't their natural part of town, and they didn't have the confidence or the contacts or think broadly enough to go to the part of town that's kind of heartland Labour and bring that into the select committee, and that's where they could have made a difference.
So let's turn to the budget itself and what came out of it. I think our key takeout is that this is a very traditional, massive recovery budget. It's not transformational in the way that the Labour Party has wanted to put itself forward as being throughout its term, and has been unable to, either because of the external circumstances or a lack of political confidence to do so. It was a massive investment in the economy, and as much as anything else, it was a signal of the government's willingness to do so. The idea of headlining the budget with we are going to commit, it's massively overused, unprecedented government support to the economy, but we are going to but we are only going to commit to a certain chunk of spending now and leave the country room to manoeuvre further down the track is smart political decision making. It does give them space to move, particularly in the event of a second surge. And just to put the size of this budget into context, the announcement of $3.9 billion into health would, in a normal time, have had a good chance to be the entire centrepiece of a government's budget, particularly a Labour government's budget. And instead, in this environment, that $3.9 billion investment was a pre-budget announcement that was then immediately overshadowed by sort of $50 billion worth of commitment. And well, one of our questioners has asked, there's these two polar views that, either this budget will save the economy, or this budget is basically a relatively untargeted and scandalous election bribe. And to be honest, I think both of those views are wrong. There was, and I go back to the idea that we're all Keynesians now, there was no option but to have a massive commitment to try and bring confidence back to the economy, because what the government wants to do is it wants to try and talk up the economy so that people get out and spend now that we're out of our houses. And this goes to a question that one of our other questioners has asked, which is, the government is expecting to reduce the debt burden by growing GDP, which is an old government trick to reduce the size of your debt to GDP ratio. Is if you can bet on growing GDP, then the size of that number goes down. And the question, this anonymous questioner asks, how realistic is this given the global environment? And they're absolutely right. And it's a point that we come to a little bit later on. We can do whatever we like here in New Zealand, but fundamentally, we're a little cork bobbing on a very, very big economic sea, and we will always be influenced to a significant degree by what happens in the economies of our major trading partners. And that's one of the reasons why we think that Treasury's forecasts are overly optimistic. Linda, do you want to talk about the vocabulary?
Well, if we think about, it seems, it's, 8-9 weeks ago that it seems like another lifetime, doesn't it? But if we had been having this conversation about what is the election campaign going to be fought on before, in the absence of COVID, well, it was Grant Robertson's plan to be talking about well-being. This was sort of this was going to be the next part of the well-being budget, starting from the budget from last year. And now that's gone. This government will still be committed to the concept of well-being, but it has to be sort of woven into this much bigger question, which is how do we rebuild and recover? And in a way, I think that that will make the election campaign a lot more chewy and a lot more interesting to voters, actually, because what we're going to be asked and what we're going to be asking politicians is who will rebuild it better. And Hayden's exactly right. The how do we rebuild it is kind of an unknown. So we're throwing a lot of money at things. We're not really sure what we're throwing money at yet. But this government's no different to any government, to governments like ours all over the world. That all of those governments are throwing money at their people and at businesses, trying to keep everybody afloat, or as many people as possible afloat. And there isn't really a shape yet to the spending, other than what you've heard a million times before, which is, shovel-ready projects and, once again, going into the conservation estate and employing people to build tracks. We've done all those things before during hard times. So as Hayden said, nothing transformational about what they're doing. This is kind of old style rebuild strategy. And the questioner who asked about, but we don't really know where it's going is absolutely right. We don't. Those details are yet to be flushed out. And I think we will get some of those in the next 2 months before the election. And that will give voters an opportunity to sort of test whether they like the direction of travel. And National will have to develop its own direction of travel and tell voters what it is. So the election is going to be all about the economy. The economy, the economy, the economy. Levels of debt, how do you pay it off? The intergenerational fairness or lack of fairness that this creates, because people my age and older, we've got our houses, as long as we keep our jobs, where the impact on us, economic impact on us, will be much less than someone who's 20 or 25 emerging into the job market, trying to find a job, trying to develop a job, trying to buy a house, trying to start a business, those younger New Zealanders are going to bear the cost of this for a very long time. So what they think about this is going to be very interesting.
Which turns us, I think, to Labour's challenge as they lead into the election. And one of our questioners has asked whether we think the election date might be postponed, not by the government, but by New Zealand First joining National to try and pass legislation deferring it, using COVID-19 as an excuse, with the idea that might buy time for New Zealand First and National to stabilise. I mean, I don't think fundamentally, I don't think it's possible for National and New Zealand First to get together and pass legislation to defer the election date. But it would be over the dead body of Jacinda Ardern and very, very many senior Labour ministers in the event that they tried to. The only thing that I could see that might postpone the election is a resurgence of COVID and a shift back to some form of lockdown. But Belinda, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, National and New Zealand First can't get legislation across. They just wouldn't be able to introduce it. But I also don't think that Winston Peters would be of a mind to do that, because for some of the reasons that I referred to earlier, Winston's best chance is National on the back foot. So, I mean, if we talk about National's relationship with Winston for a moment, because it's always been so influential, and it assisted Labour at the last election and in the ability to form the government. So the position has been under John Key and then under Simon Bridges that National won't do a deal with Winston Peters, won't have anything to do with him. I mean, we'll talk about National's leadership in a moment, but one of the smartest things that a National leader could do right now is to change that. Because that was a strategy that was only had any possibility of success when National and Labour were very, very close in level of support, so that the 1 or 2% from ACT would be enough to just take National across the line. When the difference is like this, that strategy is just a suicide mission. So you've got to how do you renegotiate that? Now, from Winston Peters' point of view, I mean, this guy is 75. I mean, I have covered Winston as a journalist I covered him for a decade. And, since then I've had children, they've grown up, I've trained, I've become a lawyer, I'm now a partner in a law firm, and my kids are about to leave home, and he's still in Parliament leading New Zealand First. I mean, he's quite unique. He's not quite unique because you can't be. He's just unique. He understands politics and the numbers of politics better than anybody in Parliament, and his numbers are better when National is behind, because it will force National to rethink the relationship with him. And as I said earlier, it will interest or intrigue National voters enough to think that they might switch to voting for him. So I think he will want the earlier election. I've changed my mind on that quite recently, because I did used to think he'd want more time, but I think now he will like the sense of crisis. Let's
touch briefly on Labour's strengths, because I mean they're pretty obvious to most people. The COVID response has built huge political capital for both the Prime Minister and the Labour government as a whole. The focus has been on her. She has done well, and she's proven her leadership in really, really tough times, which is something that she had done previously, and she is surprising a number of people with her ability to respond when the going is tough. And the weakness of the Labour leadership group has not been leadership in tough times. It's been what they do when it's business as usual. So obviously she is the centrepiece of Labour's election campaign. The other advantage is that the economic impact of COVID-19 has changed the way New Zealanders talk and feel about the economy, and that to some extent makes this a little bit of a less risky ground for Labour to be running an election campaign on. And the figures out on unemployment for the month of April suggested a significant increase in, as we talked about, young Pākehā men joining the unemployment lines, which is a tragedy. But all of a sudden, the economy and the effects of the economy are having a real front and centre impact on some of the people who it hasn't in the past, and that perhaps opens up an ability for a Labour government to talk about the economy in a way that they would like it to be seen, rather than just simply the government providing funds to build infrastructure. It's also introduced the voters to Grant Robertson, the finance minister, who's been the only really other voice in the response apart from Ashley Bloomfield, and he has really come into his own in this period. I mean, the challenge of being a finance minister and putting together a budget when you've already had a budget put to bed, and then having to throw that out and redo the entire thing should not be underestimated. I mean, they went right to the wire with this budget. It was still getting put to bed on the evening of the Monday before the budget, and they were starting to worry about whether or not they would actually have time to have the budget printed, to have paper copies available to table in the House. So that has broadened out a little bit some of the Labour leadership team, which is going to be the plank that they rely on as they head into the election. But while they're in a really good space, their position is certainly not without challenges. And I'll hand over to Linda.
So it seems slightly odd to be talking about their vulnerabilities when they've just polled, 56%. But as Hayden says, this Labour, and this is sort of confounding, actually. It's one of the confounding thing about Jacinda Ardern's leadership, but she is really exceptional at the sharp end of crisis. So we saw that in 15th of March, we saw it with White Island, we've definitely seen it with COVID. But so crisis management, double tick. But Labour has really struggled in between the crises. So as Hayden said, this business as usual stuff is when they don't seem to have been able to show that they have the same degree of competence. And that may well be because that's spread out across a range of ministers, and there's a core team of highly competent ministers in Labour, and that's the Prime Minister, that's Grant Robertson, that's Andrew Little, that's David Parker, that's Megan Woods, possibly Chris Hipkins in education. I say that only possibly. But beyond that, Labour's cabinet has really, here we are 3 years in, really failed to fire. They are either largely unknown. I mean, if I asked you to name 4 other cabinet ministers, 5 other cabinet ministers, I guess you'd get Chris Farfoy, who has been competent actually as well, but not at the same senior level. But I don't think many people could name another 3. And where we're going to now is, and this is where, there's the pivot from the health emergency to the economic emergency. We're in this period where there's going to be some very dark days, as the Prime Minister said last week, coming. They're here already for some New Zealanders. And so voters will be asking themselves about, when it comes to voting, is, the here and now. How am I feeling now, and who is going to help me get out of this dark place in the next 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years. And the campaign in September will come, August, September will come as redundancies are really beginning to bite. The wage subsidy will have, unless the government continues to extend it, and I think it just simply can't keep going on and on forever, that the wage subsidy scheme will be ending or have ended, and those businesses will be cutting down their numbers. And at the same time, income inequalities will be widening. And one of the sort of key little figures that tells such a big story in last week's budget was that the fact that the government is now going to be funding 200,000 school lunches for kids in low decile schools, so that they can get one decent meal a day. That tells you a huge story about income inequality, and that is a measure that the Prime Minister set for herself as something that she would address in this term. So there's a lot to campaign against with Labour. It's not a slam dunk. They're not good at everything by a long shot, and there are some real vulnerabilities in the package of portfolios and the way things are going to shape as we head towards the end of the year.
So two questions have popped up that are fit to be answered, to be answered here. And the first one is from Wayne, who asks whether, given that Dr. Bloomfield has overshadowed the health minister and the health minister's had his own indiscretions, what would be our view on the longevity of the health minister's career? And the simple answer to that is what career? I mean, to put it in health terms, the health minister's career is in ICU and the family is being called. The only thing that has kept him in his place so far is the fact that he was basically irrelevant to the response, and that no one wants to change horses in the middle of a crisis like that. But the only thing that his executive career in the government has going for it is a real lack of an obvious replacement outside of cabinet. I mean, you can't go directly into cabinet and pick up health, so they'd have to shift someone else from another role, and then someone would have to come into cabinet. And there aren't a lot of good candidates that are out there for promotion into the cabinet ranks. There are a few, but there isn't. That is Labour's big problem, and is going to be a problem if they win the next election. And that sort of flicks into the second question, which is, is the reason to feel concerned? Thanks, David. To be concerned about the Labour government now seeing itself as bulletproof and no longer accountable for its actions. And the answer to that is they should be very concerned about that, and I think that they are. In the main, I don't think that the senior team feels that, but there are a bunch of sort of peripheral cabinet ministers and backbenchers who do have a tendency to feel their oats a bit, and there is a real risk that some of them will trip over into arrogance or taking things for granted, and that will be something that the senior ministers are very, very alive to. We should talk about National, given the poll.
National will should have gone into this election on the back of what is a history of strong economic management and a very successful track record this term of needling Labour's failures. So the reason that Phil Twyford is no longer considered a high flyer in Labour's ranks is because of National's needling of him and his undermining his competence over a period of 3 years. They've done that remarkably successfully. And so that's where they should be, and they should be able to capitalise on uncertainty in terms of what lies ahead, to say that they are best placed to manage the economic recovery. There is this possibility, the spectre of increased tax to pay for debt. I mean, Grant Robertson wasn't ruling that out this week, and of course that's traditionally been one of Labor's go-tos.
And it's just a big stick for the National Party to beat them with,
and it's
because they can't be certain about.
Yeah, it's just a big stick. And of course, as Hayden's talking about in terms of Labor's poor performance, I mean, performers, there are a number of ministers and there are a number of issues like tourism, like support for businesses, like the delays in provision of healthcare, that give national campaigners and campaign sort of directors plenty of scope to campaign strongly against Labor. But the problem for National is, you know, where the polling is now has just upended all of that, because we all know that today, tomorrow, over the weekend, all of next week, National's not talking about small business. It's not talking about you know, the neighbour down the road whose knee's painful because she can't, you know, her operation's been delayed. They're not talking about how we're going to pay off the debt. What they're talking about at the moment is themselves. And they have to, right? Because they've got a leader that is 4% in the preferred Prime Minister's stakes, and their polling is so bad that on last night's polling, not a single list MP would survive election day. Now, Paula Bennett is a list MP. Paul Goldsmith is a list MP. So when you're in that deep, dark place as a political party, there's one thing you talk about, and that's yourselves. And of course, voters, that's like, you know, Mike Moore used to say they just take the telephone off the hook. Because voters are not interested in parties that are only interested in themselves. So the biggest question for National is not how do they fight this campaign. The biggest question now is, do they stick with Simon or do they spill? Hayden, what do you think?
Well, if I'm a backbench MP with a future in National, I'm not worried about winning this next election. I'd like to if we could. I'm worried about my job. And as Linda said, on these polls, and the polls will come back, but on these polls, they lose 16 MPs, and that wipes out their entire list. And it wipes out, you know, good performers like Paul Goldsmith and arguably Paula Bennett. But also that shift flows through into the electorates, and it doesn't take much of a flow through into the electorates to wipe out some of those high-performing MPs that a lot of people see as the next future of the National Party. You know, I'm talking about people like Chris Bishop in Hutt South, Nikki Kay in Auckland Central, and on the list, Nicola Willis here in Wellington, will all be gone. And so if I'm one of them, all I'm interested in is, can we claw our way back so that I have a shot at keeping my job? And that to me would say the telephone's already off the hook with Simon, and like him, but he's not the person to keep me employed as an MP. And so I would be looking at who that might be. The two options that are sort of forming is Todd Muller and Nikki Kay as a potential ticket, and then the ever looming spectre of Judith Collins in the background. And Todd, we picked Todd Muller as one of the stars of the likely stars when he came in. He's been very, very quiet since then. He's very much a National Party MP in the traditional mould. But the National Party is changing, and there is a sort of shift between the sort of old National, you know, to massively generalise, old National kind of farming base, and a new wing of the National Party that is a lot more socially right. It's aligned with, you know, particularly there's some themes of evangelism there, and that is an opening divide in the National Party, and maybe they decide that they really need someone who can take it to Labour, that can claw back as much of this change as possible, and get them to a point where they're within cooey of winning the election. And if I'm one of them, my money's probably on Judith to be the person to do that, with a view perhaps to Christopher Luxon taking over in the next term if they're in opposition. But my view on this changes week to week. So Linda, what do you think?
I think that individual MPs will be thinking about their future. You're exactly right. And I think that Luxon is intriguing, right? Because he's been endorsed by John Key quite recently. And there are many in the party who see or believe that he might be another John Key. And I mean, John Key was a silver bullet. You know, he was one of those rare kind of leaders that allowed National to sit back, if you like, and let him do the heavy lifting. He's, in the same way that Labour's done with Jacinda Ardern. So everybody, all parties want a leader like that. So there is a strong feeling that Luxon might be the next John Key. He's not John Key though, of course, because Luxon is quite a religious figure, and that, as Hayden says, is a new dimension for National. So the more Liberals in National will want to lead towards Todd Muller, and the more Conservatives may want to go towards Judith in the thought that she could be a sort of transition leader, get the party through this election, and then Luxon comes in. But I mean, Luxon won't be in if they do so badly. So that's there's a lot of moving parts here. The question too is, how does Simon go? He's indicated this morning that he intends to stick around. I mean, take that with a grain of salt. That's what Andrew Little said. And at the same time, he was asking Jacinda Ardern to take over. So we shouldn't read too much into that. But also, if we look at his personality, he is a scrapper, and he has stood down potential challenges before. He could do a lot of damage on the way out. He'll get no thanks if he does, but he could make it very difficult for the next leader. And what National needs, if they are going to change leaders, and I think it's inevitable that they will, they need it to be swift, and they need everybody to fall in immediately behind the new leader in a very clean way. Labour can teach us all a lesson as to how not to change leaders, because with David Shearer and David Cunliffe, they did it all wrong, and they paid a very high price for a long period of time. So National will be wary of that too.
Just a bit conscious of time, so I'm going to just move on now to the minor parties. And our view here is that probably both New Zealand First and Greens are happy with the budget. The Greens will have some concerns about climate change coming off the front burner, if you like, but there is enough in there to keep them happy. There is pressure on them to be seen to do more, and a lot of that is coming from people like Russell Norman and Kevin Haig, who are still very powerful within the Green Party. And Kane has asked us whether, with the Greens who suffer a visibility issue, do we think they'll seek to differentiate from Labour or align into the election? They haven't got the concessions that New Zealand First seem to have, and what's their tactical decision? For me, and Linda may well have a different view, if I was them, I would be stapling myself to the Labour Party as much as I can, because they're and we saw this in the last election, right? The Ngāti Ture issue was the thing that put Jacinda Ardern, after a sort of Rube Goldberg machine's kind of machinations, into the leadership of the Labour Party, and then the Greens vote collapsed. So I would be staying very, very close, and I would be saying we've been part of this response, we will be part of this response, and green and tech is the way forward for the New Zealand economy. But Linda, do you have a different view?
I think they will stick to Labor, but I think they've got a great opportunity to distinguish themselves during the campaign, because they do have a different path and a different prescription for recovery and rebuild. And this is the time to spell it out really clearly. And if Labor is doing very well, in the same way, it's a similar calculation to Winston, right? If Labor is doing very, very well, then the Greens should be able to pull across some Labor voters who want a centre-left government, but who might want more of a Green prescription going forward. And the Greens can campaign on that to say, you know, yes, you want to have Jacinda Ardern as Prime Minister, and so do we. But if you want more focus on, green energy, green projects, public transport, all of the things that are very high, clean water, on the Greens list of priorities, then you need to have the Greens as part of the mix. And I think that will be quite a persuasive argument for a slice of Labor's vote. And that slice will be enough.
We've talked a lot already about Winston and ACT, so we might just move on to the wildcards for the election campaign. And the first and most obvious one is what happens if there is a resurgence of COVID-19, and would the government in that situation, and with the economy as we have the same bottle to be able to put us back into lockdown, and that would be very, 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 very challenging. And obviously there's the point that we talked about earlier on, that our economic fate is primarily driven outside of New Zealand, and if the world is a basket case, well, our options are really limited. And to pick up a point that's been made by Michael, if we can maintain our position to be first past COVID, then is there an opportunity for New Zealand to market itself as a stable place to do, a safe place to do business, and for our clean food and stable services? And I think that's right, Michael, but it's a big if. The other thing I'd add potentially into that mix is education, because a 14-day quarantine is a big thing if you're coming to New Zealand for a 14-day holiday. But if you're sitting in Singapore or Shanghai, and you need to send your child somewhere where they're going to be away from you for education, well, you can see a lot of the New Zealand response really giving some comfort to those parents, and maybe that is a place where New Zealand can really focus on to recover. But again, all of these three things work together, right? How long do we actually have the political will to keep our borders closed and to require anyone who moves across it to do 14 days of quarantine, either in a airport hotel in Auckland or in some other sort of managed environment? How much patience does New Zealand have? And it's a point that we've made already, that Winston's survival instinct is very strong. Linda, any other thoughts on the wildcards before we turn to the...
No, I think the point about New Zealand, promoting itself as a stable, sensible, science-based place to do business is a powerful card that we have. And the beautiful thing about it is we don't even need to do the promotion, because global media has done that for us. Wherever you look, international media have looked towards New Zealand and compared our pathway and our political management of this crisis very favourably compared to their leaders. So I think that message is out. The question about how long we can be a fortress is the key thing for me. I think there'll be an enormous pressure to open the bubble with Australia. I think all the reasons for doing that are compelling, but it does come with risk, and that's the calculation. But the pressure to do that will be very, very strong, both from businesses like Air New Zealand, all of the tourism operators, but also just regular New Zealanders who've got family there, and to have that free flow of people coming across the Tasman is just sort of part of who we are now. So keeping that gate shut is the hardest one for the government, I think.
And finally, I mean, we've been very big at Deanton's Kensington Swan about looking forward to what is after COVID. What is the next normal look like? And just in the last couple of minutes that we've got, the fundamental question, and this was raised by Grant Robertson when he said, look, if your house burns down, you probably don't build it again exactly the same way that it was. You look to try and build something newer and better. And for me, I think the question is, well, sure, that's what we all want to do, but there are some real constraints that will be on the government about how they can do that. And what sorts of things could they be looking to, Linda, to try and rebuild New Zealand within the parameters that they have?
I think the answer to that is we don't know. And I do think, I mean, there was in the day after the budget, there was quite a good deal of criticism about the fact that the money was out, we didn't have a plan. What is the plan? I mean, the plan currently is to be fleet-footed. The plan is not to get tied into a plan that might not work, or that might be out of date, or might not be able to be delivered. So, and I get that, but the government can't keep that as their plan for much longer. You know, we do need to see more flesh on the bones, I think. The shovel-ready stuff worries me, because I think that two things about it worry me. One is you look at Wellington and say a project like Transmission Gully, which now is mired in delays. Those projects all of those shovel-ready projects that the government's talking about are really complicated. They take a lot of time. If they were simple, they'd all have been built years ago. You know, it's just never that straightforward. So I think they're high risk. I also think that the kind of people that they employ is a mismatch with the kind of people who are the first round of redundancies. So I don't think that the baristas, the hotel, bed makers, the waiters in the cafes are going to be a perfect match with shovel-ready infrastructure plans. And the government accepts that, because that's why it's putting so much effort into apprenticeships and so forth. But I do think there's got to be a better mash between the private sector and government to make sure that we are training people to do the kind of things that we actually want to be doing. And again, that's sort of knee-jerk.
And again, that response, we've got lots of people out of work. We need to do lots of projects. We should invest in trades and apprenticeships. I mean, $1 billion to trades and apprenticeships is actually desperately needed, but it's very traditional labour response to that. And a lot, I hark back to, the future of work that Grant Robertson did early on, and go, well, actually, you're potentially preparing people for the last jobs. You know, they're new jobs to them, but they're the jobs of the old economy. And what I want to see from the government and from the opposition in going into the next election is, well, actually, how thoughtfully can we prepare not just the people who are out of work, but the kids who are coming through university and trades training and high school right now, for the jobs that they're going to have and they're going to need. And that's a big challenge. And I hope someone's going to have the vision to take it on, but I'm often disappointed in these things. So we are now out of time. Thank you all very much for joining us. Please check out the Big Reset, which is on Deanton's Kensington Swans website, which is deantons.co.nz. We've got a lot of content there about how we are thinking about the next normal and how New Zealand might look to recover. We've got more content coming as we really get our hands dirty in looking at the detail of the budget. So that material is there. We'd love for you to go and read it and get on and tell us what you think of it. Send Linda or I an email, hit us up on LinkedIn, tell us where we've got it wrong. We'd love the opportunity to have that conversation with you. And as you know, we've recorded this webinar, and it will be available after we're finished. So thank you all again. Enjoy the rest of your day.